Today at the National Press Club, lead economist at Impact Economics and Policy, Dr. Angela Jackson, Westpac's business banks, Besa Deda, and CEO of the Grattan Institute, Dr. Aruna Sathanapally. Ahead of the federal budget, they'll give the Women in Economics Network pre-budget address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. In 2 weeks' time, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, will be addressing the National Press Club, the day after delivering the 2024 budget. In recent weeks, he has been having to change his message about the ambitions and challenges of the budget quite rapidly. That's not just because the international and domestic economic environments are changing, but because the Australian domestic political debate is also changing. Just as inflation was starting to subside as a risk, it appears to have erupted again. Just as the international economy appeared to be delivering strong revenues and, as a result, a likely healthy budget surplus, commodity prices have fallen. And, as we have just heard in the last hour from the Prime Minister, the sense of national crisis over the murder of Australian women by their intimate partners is creating new demands on the government, not just for immediate support for victims of violence, but also to address huge issues like affordable housing. To discuss all these things today, we are joined by three eminent women economists: Dr. Angela Jackson, who's the National Chair of Women in Economics, Besa Deda, Chief Economist at Westpac's Business Bank, and Dr. Aruna Sathanapally of the Grattan Institute. Dr. Jackson will address us first, and then Aruna will speak to us, and then we'll talk to Besa about the macroeconomic outlook. So I'd invite Angela to come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the room and watching today at home. Now, as National Chair of the Women in Economics Network, it is an honour to be back here at the National Press Club with our inaugural chair in the room, Danielle Wood, who's been a regular at this event over the years. She misses out this year as the new chair of the Productivity Commission, and our immediate past chair, Associate Professor Leonora Riz, in the audience. The Women in Economics Network was established to support women in the economics profession, and this event has been an important part of that mission over the past 8 years. We have seen the voice of female economists elevated more broadly, and where there had been no females leading our major economic institutions, we now have 3 at the helm. The national conversation has also dramatically changed when it comes to the economy, both in aesthetic and also, importantly, in substance. With the support of other non-economist female leaders such as Sam Mostyn, AO, the incoming Governor-General, we have seen the conversation around the economy change, with the role of women driving economic growth now more widely recognised, and the need for Australia to really lift its game when it comes to gender equity firmly part of the national policy agenda. We even managed to resurrect the Women's Budget Statement under the previous government, and under the current budget government, we have seen a return to gender-responsive budgeting, which is embedding a gender lens across the budget. This is going to be an insurance policy for the future in terms of the gains for gender equity. Now, today, of course, we are previewing the 2024-25 budget, which is being crafted in a tumultuous economic, geopolitical and social climate. Social cohesion is being tested globally, with living standards deteriorating as inflation wreaks havoc in terms of almost a decade's worth of real income gains globally. And central banks are doing all they can to contain inflation. And here in Australia, we have faced what has been a very difficult year with the defeat of the Voice referendum, a housing shortage putting the housing market in significant crisis, and a disturbing increase in gender-based violence taking the lives of women around the country. It is an extremely difficult environment that, in less than 2 weeks' time, the Treasurer will reveal, however, how $1 in every $4 that will be spent in the economy over the next year. While usually a per capita recession, rising unemployment and an imminent election would mean a big spending, everyone wins budget, such an approach this year would only fuel inflation and underpin and make the job of the Reserve Bank even harder. It's simply not possible this year. So what should a budget prioritise in such an environment? With the high opportunity cost associated with every extra dollar spent, it is imperative, from an economist's perspective, that the budget focuses on measures that lift the productive capacity of the economy. Now, we'd possibly say this at any point, of course, but it's particularly critical right now. This does not mean a budget that ignores gender-based violence or entrenched disadvantage or cost of living pressures. Quite the opposite. Last week, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, chaired by Jenny Macklin and on which I am a member, released its annual report to government on the priorities to address disadvantage and lift economic inclusion. Rather than seeing this report as a wish list of the bleeding hearts, it should be seen for what it is, a blueprint for the best possible future Made in Australia policy, one focused on building and fully utilising our greatest resource, our people. Historically, and perhaps even in some of the dustier parts of our profession today, there was a belief in a trade-off between equity and efficiency, that greater equity would stifle economic growth, that economic policy should be focused on increasing the size of the pie and not on how that pie is shared. But that evidence clearly shows that this trade-off is a fallacy. Equity does not undermine efficiency, with a more equal economies experiencing stronger economic growth over the long term. More equally shared pies, as it turns out, are bigger pies. Policies aimed at enhancing economic inclusion, at fostering inclusive growth, are now championed by the International Monetary Fund and the OECD because they recognise that these policies underpin sustainable economic growth. Economic inclusion involves ensuring every member of society is supported to fully participate in our economy, to reach their potential. Untapped potential, whether it's women not supported to participate in paid work or children of income support recipients not supported to attend early childhood education and care, or the unemployed not supported to re-engage in education and employment, all result in lower levels of participation and productivity. This reduces the level of economic growth we can sustain over time and ultimately lowers living standards for all of us. In times like today, with falling living standards, rising financial stress and the prospect of higher unemployment, greater economic exclusion risks long-term scarring and reduced participation and productivity over the long term. While the budget will be filled with the economic forecasts that foreshadow this tumultuous period, there is a need to acknowledge the human cost. Today, I will outline why the 2024-25 budget should be anticipating rising rates of family violence, the negative impacts on childhood development and the interrupted connections with the labour market, and mitigating against these impacts through policies that lift economic inclusion. Now, family violence, it's pervasive and it's very topical at the moment and a very emotional issue, but it is pervasive amongst our society. It makes the family home, where we should be our safest, statistically the least safe place for a woman to be. Power, as we know, is at the centre of gender-based violence. The more gender-based violence in a society, the less power women have, the less likely women are to participate in paid work, the less productive women are likely to be at work, and the less likely women are to have economic security. Some estimates put the economic impact of gender-based violence at between 1% to 2% of gross domestic product, or for Australia, up to around $50 billion a year in lost output. New statistics released yesterday report an alarming increase in the rate of intimate partner homicide, with almost a 30% increase in 12 months alone. While these figures are shocking, these statistics should not be a surprise. Rates of family violence are known to increase in the aftermath of major disruptive events such as fires, floods and pandemics. Rates of family violence are known to increase when households are under financial stress. While many of the solutions lay in reforms based in state-based criminal justice system, there is clearly a role for the Commonwealth budget, possibly recognised today by the Prime Minister, in supporting these reforms and in limiting the significant economic costs of family violence on women. Escaping family violence too often means experiencing homelessness, poverty and financial insecurity. Work by Professor Alice Campbell at the Life Course Centre found that women that have experienced family violence are 3 times more likely to be experiencing financial insecurity. The Commonwealth Government recognised this today with its substantial commitment to make permanent the Leaving Violence program, and that is to be welcomed, as are the reforms in last year's budget to the single parenting payment, which reduced the severity of poverty experienced by a number of single mothers in Australia, 50% or more of whom have experienced family violence. But it remains the case that 2/3 of people relying on the parenting payment are in poverty. It's the highest group living in poverty in this country when you look at income support recipients. So what we need to see, and what the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee looked at, was we need to see a substantial increase in those income support payments, including JobSeeker, to really address these underlying and enduring impacts of poverty, particularly on single parents and particularly on those that have escaped family violence. We also see too often women who are escaping violence end up at specialist homelessness services. They're the biggest client seeking assistance. And with inadequate housing options, they are regularly forced to choose between returning to a violent partner and homelessness. Research I conducted in 2021 for the Everybody's Home campaign found that 7,690 women return to a violent partner each year because they have nowhere else to live, and a further 9,120 experience homelessness. Latest figures from Victoria show that women fleeing violence are waiting on average 2 years for social housing. There are undoubtedly many Australians right now paying the price for our broken housing system, but none more so than women and their children that have experienced family violence. The Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee recommendations to lift the rate of rent assistance and address the critical shortage of social housing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities will help alleviate some of this pressure. But we need to see a generational commitment to replenish our diminished social housing stock and the political fortitude to tackle the much discussed but minimally actioned reforms to our housing market to ensure that women have somewhere to go when they leave a violent partner. Included in the list of recommendations from the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee are important reforms informed by the work of Professor Kay Cook to the interaction between the child support system and the family tax benefit system to ensure that it's no longer used by men to continue the financial abuse of their ex-partners. At the very least, we should be ensuring that the Commonwealth's own systems are not being weaponised against women. Now, we also know that growing up in a household that is under financial stress impacts childhood development outcomes, reducing rates of school completion and increasing rates of poor mental health. As more families are under financial stress, policies that protect children from these long-term impacts should be very high on our priority list. Access to quality early childhood education and care is a policy with the strongest evidence for improving outcomes, particularly for children from lower income families. Lower levels of parental education, higher levels of financial stress and less access to services all contribute to undermine the development of children in low income households. This makes access to early childhood education and care even more critical for these children. Whereas 4 in 5 children that attend early childhood education and care are developmentally on track at the start of school, only 3 in 5 who do not attend are on track. Children who start behind, they never ever catch up. They fall further and further behind as they progress through school. Because of this, in most developed countries, there are programs to provide extra support to children from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend early childhood education and care. not in Australia. Since the 1960s, the Head Start program in the United States has preferentially provided children from disadvantaged backgrounds with access to early childhood education and care, not in Australia. In countries like Canada, in Sweden, in South Korea, children of parents that don't work receive the same access to early childhood education as their peers whose parents do work, not in Australia. In Australia, we proactively and by design exclude the most vulnerable children from accessing the recommended 3 days of early childhood education and care. We do this through limiting access to the subsidised early childhood education and care based on the work activity of parents in an attempt to incentivise labour force participation. We allow what is at best dubious economics and views about what those out of the labour market deserve to deny children that would benefit the most from early childhood education and care access. Each year, we delay providing these children access, we reduce future GDP by at least $11.5 billion through the very well-established connection between school completion, which lifts participation and productivity through life. The Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee has joined the ACCC and the Women's Economic Security Task Force in calling for the activity test to be abolished. Even the Productivity Commission, previously supportive of the policy, has flagged major reforms to ensure every Australian child has access to 3 days of early childhood education and care. Alongside addressing the low wages in the childcare sector that are impacting supply right now, abolishing the activity test should be a priority in the budget. Now, the other thing economists do like to talk a lot about is the scarring effects of unemployment, with those impacted suffering long-term drops in income from people out of the labour force. We really like studying this. It's a good shock that we can really see the long-term impacts. Yet our system of supports in Australia for the unemployed tends to enhance rather than minimise that scarring. The rate of unemployment benefit is so far below the poverty line that it's not a livable payment. At best, this means people are more likely to take a job for which they are poorly matched, which reduces productivity in the long run. At worst, the capacity of people to find work is undermined through the negative impacts of living in poverty, including on people's mental health. The Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee heard from many Australians who are living on JobSeeker about the negative consequences, and their stories will become more common in the months and years ahead unless we see a substantial increase in the payment to address its historical under-indexation. Unemployment also means interacting with an employment services system that has been, and this is a strong word, but it has been corrupted in its primary purpose to support Australians to gain the skills to get back into work. It's kind of what you think an employment support system would do. Instead, it has been turned into a mechanism to enforce mutual obligation. Mutual obligation may have a role in our system, but it has been allowed to become the primary purpose of the system. This serves nobody's interests. The government has received 2 very comprehensive reports which provide a clear roadmap for reform, and the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee has called on the implementation to be fast-tracked in this budget. Limiting the negative impacts of unemployment will benefit the Australians that find themselves out of work in the months and years ahead, but also the broader economy in the years ahead. These are undoubtedly difficult economic and social times, with potentially long-lasting impacts. It's not possible for the government to spend its way out of this economic challenge. Inflation is a truly wicked problem, but we can mitigate against the worst of these impacts through smart and targeted investments and reforms which enhance economic inclusion. Not only will this address the most acute needs of today, it will also help build the productive capacity of our people and our economy for the future. We all win in a more inclusive economy where everyone is reaching their full potential. Thank you.
Aruna.
Thank you, Angela. I too would like to pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and thank you to the National Press Club and to the Women in Economics Network for inviting me to join today's event. There is no shortage of eminent female economists who could be speaking to you, and I'm delighted to share the stage with Angela and Besa. I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so looking up from the foreground to the horizon. It is the unenviable job of the Treasurer to respond not only to the calls for immediate action that Angela has outlined, but also to address those structural challenges that the country faces. And it is our job as Australians to understand what lies beyond the short term and be prepared to make some tough choices. It was only 9 months ago that a series of challenges were clearly set out for us in the Treasury's intergenerational report. These are an ageing population, putting pressure on public spending and services and creating structural workforce shortages; climate change, both the physical impacts that are already upon us and the task of transforming our economy to achieve net zero emissions; a less stable global geopolitical environment; and a tax system in urgent need of reform to ensure fairness and sustainability. Now, following on from Angela, I appreciate this might all sound quite dismal, so let me be clear up front. We are a rich and lucky country. We enjoy one of the longest life expectancies in the world. We have one of the most highly educated populations in the world. And this continent that we share is a remarkable place. We have some real strengths, reasons to hold faith that the future can be bright, provided we face up to tackling our challenges and make good policy choices. Now, we've been hearing a lot recently about our natural resources and how they will equip Australia to thrive in a net zero world. And I will come shortly to the minerals in the ground and the sun in the sky, but first I do want to talk about people, as Angela has said, our greatest resource. From a structural and long-term perspective, our people are critical. Now, I don't need to repeat what Angela just said, but I would absolutely endorse that early childhood and education is a necessary investment in our productive capacity in the future. And that sounds really hard-headed, but even when you set aside all the good reasons to be doing it, there are sound economic reasons to be investing in our future boys, our boys and girls and our future workforce. I will also say that a growing population in which people come from around the world to build their lives here has underpinned Australia's prosperity for more than half a century. More than 30% of us were born overseas. Add to them those who have a parent born overseas, and that's the majority of Australians. When we talk about migrants, we are talking about ourselves. So our ability to be a diverse, dynamic and cohesive society, including how we treat people when they come and live here, will be the basis on which we can continue to attract motivated and skilled people who help provide essential services, boost our productivity through knowledge acquired overseas, and contribute to our community in ways far beyond their day job. Angela's also talked about the importance of untapped potential. Women in Australia are amongst the most educated in the world, and the evidence shows that they have the aspirations to match. And yet, Australia has an embarrassingly gender-segregated economy and entrenched gender norms in society that devalue women. So when I think about our future society and economy, I imagine what women could achieve if we truly tackled the inequality that affects all aspects of our lives. So with that, let me turn to what's on the horizon, and I'll focus on two fundamental challenges to Australia, or for Australia. The first is our imperative to transition to a decarbonised global economy over the coming decades, and this is an existential imperative. Here we have considerable advantages as a country: the abundant land to generate low-cost solar and wind, and a range of minerals that will be required for a net zero world. The government has signalled that in this budget and in the lead up to the next election, it wants to make some big bets on Australia's industrial transformation to realise these opportunities. Now, the mere mention of this type of deliberate industry policy seems to operate like some kind of public policy Rorschach test. Everyone sees something different. For some, government intervention to underwrite or unlock investment in green industries will enable a necessary structural transformation of our economy away from coal and gas and ensure that Australia is keeping pace with other countries as they seek to carve out new industries. Others see a risk of wasted public money as the government tries to pick winners. Decision-making becomes distorted by too many objectives and too much lobbying, and we end up propping up uncompetitive manufacturing for decades. Like a Rorschach inkblot, it can be both. Grattan Institute has set out the necessary role for a 21st century industry policy. That is not the same thing as made in Australia. The objective should not be to shield Australian industries from healthy competition. Rather, it is necessary because of the scale of the economic transformation we need to achieve. Markets alone do not generally provide adequate incentives for research and development in new technologies. And investing in low emissions technologies is particularly complex and uncertain. Investors face high costs, low returns, and the risk of competitors free riding on lessons learned. At the same time, we have failed to give markets clear signals about the price of carbon that they need in order to make the right long-term investments. Yet, we require investments in assets that will last for decades, if not longer. Finally, we have a real binding deadline. Market forces are not good at managing structural transformations at high speed. So there is absolutely a role for government in ensuring we get to net zero emissions in time to avoid runaway climate change. Now, is there a risk of a return to the bad old days of protectionist objectives, of throwing good money after bad on a lost cause where we are unlikely to ever match global productivity? Yes. But, unlike a Rorschach blot, the ink on the Future Made in Australia Act is not yet dry. The choices that the government makes about it, how it sets up this policy, will have a big impact on the policy's success or failure. Disciplined use of limited public money will be critical. We need to be clear-eyed about where our comparative advantage may realistically lie. Take the case of batteries. Our research shows that while Australia may be able to compete on the early stages of critical mineral processing, our labour, logistics and import costs add up to too much to be competitive for the final stages of battery manufacturing. The thing I'm most worried about is that while governments are making these design choices, which we can't afford to get wrong, they'll be pulled in multiple directions, trying to meet multiple policy objectives at once. And they'll have to swat away lobbyists and rent seekers who will inevitably emerge. The IMF has recently warned that the social benefits of industry policy decrease when politically connected sectors have more say over who wins subsidies. This is why we say decisions about government support should be made by experts at arm's length from government, like the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, which has an independent board. Decision makers should have clear criteria, but they should be aiming for outcomes, not specific technologies, projects, companies or specific regions. And it's essential that grants and investment come with clear evaluation and exit criteria, so we don't end up wasting money, people and resources that we need elsewhere. The second looming challenge is Australia's structural budget deficit. Whether or not we see a surplus in 2 weeks, Australia is not raising enough money for what we spend. We are a relatively low-tax country with high service expectations. Pre-COVID, Australia was the 8th lowest ranked country in the OECD for tax collections relative to our economy's size and 5 percentage points lower than the OECD average. Yet, Australians expect high-quality healthcare, aged care and disability care, amongst other things. Like other rich nations, government spending in Australia has grown as a share of the economy, particularly in recent decades. But our tax base is going in the opposite direction, narrowing as the population ages and with the growing cost of tax concessions. This leaves a structural gap. Now, you can tackle a structural problem by reducing spending, increasing revenue, and by growing the economy. And growing the economy is the easiest solution to sell, but the hardest to achieve in practice. Australia, like other advanced countries, is expecting slower economic growth over the next 40 years than we've had over the past 40 years. Even if productivity growth exceeds expectations, it's unlikely to close the structural gap. As a relatively low-tax country, we can afford to raise more revenue, but of course, there are better and worse ways to do this. Broadening the tax base and reducing tax concessions tend to be less economically damaging than simply raising the headline rate of tax. Australia's tax mix asks workers and companies to shoulder most of the burden, while offering substantial concessions for wealth. Wealth in housing and superannuation gets particularly generous treatment. Take superannuation tax breaks, for example. They cost the budget almost $45 billion a year and are projected to cost more than the age pension by 2036. These tax breaks predominantly benefit the top 20% of income earners, so they do little to actually reduce age pension spending. Meanwhile, the combination of capital gains tax breaks and negative gearing encourages speculation in the housing market in place of other more productive uses of people's funds. Now, I've raised housing and super taxes, and we know that governments balk at these types of politically difficult choices around tax. And that's because it gets pretty noisy when there are any losers to be found, as though there is some world where we don't have to countenance any trade-offs. But frankly, we're sitting on a wretched generational bargain, and it's gone on for long enough. Young people today already face the prospect of weaker wages growth, higher hurdles to owning a home, or more likely a lifetime of renting, and a future increasingly shaped by extreme weather and natural disasters. Yet, we ask our young people, our children and grandchildren, to contribute more towards supporting older generations than our older generations ever contributed when they were working age. Now, received wisdom holds that pre-election budgets aren't ambitious, and nor are governments with small majorities. But we need to make some tough decisions. Our future can be bright, but not if we squander our strengths. And here I come back to people, specifically not taking for granted social cohesion and the importance of our shared stake in our democracy. Democracy isn't just a vote in a ballot box every 3 or 4 years. Democracy is us, all of us, governing ourselves. And to do that, we need to be informed, and we need to be talking to each other about the type of society we want to create. I believe that Australians are ready and willing to have these difficult conversations if they are given the facts and the evidence. Indeed, Grattan Institute has previously argued that the public are more open to tough conversations on tax than the media is, and Danny's here, so she may remember saying that. We're also seeing a willingness now to talk seriously about the fact that our planning system is creating profound housing inequities in our cities. But we shouldn't need things to reach a breaking point before we have these conversations. So I've talked today about the task of the Treasurer, but I'd close by saying this to the Shadow Treasurer. Let's have the real debates that we need to have about this budget and leading into the next election. About tax reform, about how we get enough housing, about what a 21st century industry policy looks like, about how we ensure our public services are sustainable, how we ensure we have the workforce and the skills that we know we need, and ultimately, about what is fair in such a rich country. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for setting up how complicated it all is with being the Treasurer. Besa, could we start the questioning by getting you to reflect a bit on the sort of nuts and bolts of the budget, what the macroeconomic outlook is, and what are the bottom lines we should be looking for next week?
Thanks, Laura. I think the economic context is really important. The budget has to be appropriate for the times. So I think maybe a good starting point for your question is to think about the last major update on the budget, which was the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, MyEFO, back in mid-December of last year. At the time of MyEFO, with the data that we had on hand, we know that the economy had slowed. In fact, GDP had grown by just 0.2% in the September quarter. Inflation was at 5.6%. It had come down from the peak. It was still elevated and still above the Reserve Bank's inflation target band. The unemployment rate, 3.7% in October, near a 50-year low. And financial markets expecting inflation to moderate, but actually pricing in rate cuts to begin in Australia in November of this year. Well, what a dramatic difference just a couple of months makes. Fast forward to now, and you have an inflation rate of 3.6%, still elevated, still above the Reserve Bank's inflation target band, and concerns that inflation is sticky. You've got an unemployment rate of 3.8%, so it's barely budged and it's near the 50-year low. You've got an economy that has slowed, But it's toddling along and actually has been helped by several factors, including an explosion in net overseas migration that has helped to support consumer spending and economic activity. And then if we turn to the world economy, well, a sharp downturn has been avoided, and that's thanks to the Chinese recovery and the US economy being quite resilient. And in fact, global growth this year looks like it will be better than previously expected. And so now we're in a situation where actually interest rate markets have fully taken off rate cuts from the table for this year. And as of this morning, interest rate markets are attaching a 20% probability of a rate hike before the end of this year. So that means that interest rate relief will take time to come, and inflation is still too high. And so the problem for the federal government is they cannot deliver a budget that will boost aggregate demand at a time when inflation is still elevated. They can't afford to inflame inflation and run the risk that rate relief might take even longer to come. Now, if we think about the federal fiscal policy, it is actually loosening slightly. You've got the stage 3 tax cuts, you've got the increased investment in housing, you've got the increased investment in the green transition. So it's already loosening a little bit. And then if you throw in the spending by the different state and territory governments, the national fiscal impulse is actually quite notable. Yet, cost of living challenges are significant for Australians. We know this consistently from surveys, and low-income households and Australians that are quite vulnerable do need help. Rosie Batty spoke here just a few weeks ago. I listened to that and I was deeply moved by her keynote address. And she spoke to those Australians that are most vulnerable. So like Angela, I do welcome that spending on domestic violence. But the macro backdrop is really important because any spending measures need to be very highly targeted and they need to come alongside other cost-saving measures. Otherwise, you risk inflaming inflation too much. Now, it doesn't stop there because there are a bunch of mega trends that are evolving through the world economies, particularly the major economies and particularly in Australia. And they are demographics, the ageing of the population and falling fertility rates. They are the intensification of the fragmentation of globalisation. They are the rise in geopolitical risks, and they are the weakness in productivity growth. And collectively, these factors, Laura, mean that over the medium term, we might actually see growth that's a bit weaker. We might actually see inflation a little bit higher. And we might actually see the structure of all interest rates be a bit higher in the post-COVID world compared with the world that we lived in between the GFC and COVID. Does that mean that governments can't do policy reform? No, but it might argue that actually governments need to do bold policy reform. And we don't need to look any further than housing on this front. There is a housing shortage. There is strong population growth. Building approvals are trending down. Residential construction is softening. And it's hard to see that housing shortage going away anytime soon. It does require a multi-pronged, long-term approach to address. This has been a problem that's been growing over many decades. We can't lay the blame at the feet of any one government, but it does require, I think, quite bold reform over the long term. Tragically, what we are seeing is a widening in wealth inequality across and between generations, and so then we're also sadly seeing a rise in homelessness.
Thank you so much. Just going to all of those points, I suppose, if I could just ask one further question before I open it to the floor. We hear a lot about the government saying that they want to do spending measures which don't provoke inflation. And I was just wondering, what the various members of the panel think about the measures that they've taken, say, in last year's budget, and whether they're able to, whether they've got through that, whether they've threaded that needle, And what scope is there, and what sort of policies could they do this year to address that? And in the context of your remark about bold reform, given that one of the biggest components of inflation in the last quarter was rents, how do you trade that off, in the shorter term, in terms of trying to increase the supply of housing? So I don't know who wants to go first there.
I think in terms of rental assistance, we've got to think about the residential vacancy rates. They're very low. So rental markets are tight in every metropolitan city and even in some regional cities. So one of the issues, I guess, with raising rental assistance is against that backdrop, it may just actually flow through to higher rents. So really what we need to see is greater housing supply so that we can see a moderation in the growth in dwelling prices and make it more affordable for Australians, and a moderation in rents. And so it comes back to, well, what sort of measures can we do to lift housing supply? And that really requires a multi-pronged approach. I think you need to look at planning, I think you need to look at tenancy laws, and I think you need to look at the interaction of taxes, and you need to look at that holistically. And then also think about, well, what sort of reform can you make over a longer term? I always think about the Scottish philosopher William Macaskill, who has coined the term long-termism. And he talks about positively affecting long-term future outcomes as a priority of our times. And I think the fact that you've got more than 5 million Australians that own a home or have a mortgage on their home, it makes the housing challenge more politically fraught. Because in any one year, you've only got 100,000 people, roughly, that want to enter the housing market. And so it's important, I think, to take a very gradual long-term approach, but also to be multi-pronged and to think about it holistically.
I think to your point in terms of how they sort of weave that narrow path that they're on, I think the last budget is, I think, been widely accepted that it was pretty well targeted and provided, people, particularly at the lower end, with the support they need and wasn't overly inflationary. The real challenge they have this year is those stage 3 tax cuts. We've kind of stopped talking about them because of the changes and, that address some of the equity concerns. But, would you be calling for the stage 3 tax cuts right now if they weren't currently in the budget? Absolutely no way. I don't think you'd find any economist going, what we need right now is, $20 billion worth of tax cuts. Let's do it, guys. They are a real problem for the government. Now, they might get lucky in terms of those other inflationary pressures coming off, but it's looking like there isn't that much luck there. And so those stage 3 tax cuts are undoubtedly going to add to aggregate demand and cause more issues and more headaches, perhaps, than even the Reserve Bank was hoping for. But that doesn't mean we don't need very well targeted support. There are people out there who've suffered really significant falls in their real incomes. That is causing a number of households to be under financial pressure, and there are real impacts from that, which is what I went to in my speech. And so we do need very targeted support. It's not the time for the big stimulus payments. Everybody wins a prize. It's very targeted. Unfortunately for the government, they have baked in these tax cuts back from, 2018. They were first announced, and I remember at the time Danny and I saying, this is not a great idea, guys. You don't know where you're going to be in 6 years' time, and we've seen that. We're in a very different economic climate to where we were there, and they're not really appropriate for the times.
Yeah, look, just kind of echoing what Angela's just said, one of the things that's good about fiscal policy is, unlike monetary policy, it's not a blunt instrument. And so you can simultaneously do what Besa says, which is keep your fiscal impulse low, but you can think about how you distribute that and think about targeting, so that where you are spending money, you're spending it where it can have the greatest impact, and that you are thinking about not necessarily shielding people who can afford it from the cost of living pressures, from the bracket creep, because those are part of your automatic stabilisers that are cooling down consumption amongst the people who can afford to pull back a little bit, but not necessarily hitting those who can least afford to wear it.
Thanks. Poppy Johnson's got a question.
Thank you all for your comments. I just wanted to hone in on the activity test for childcare subsidies mentioned by a couple of you. We've been pushing to abolish them or change them for a while, but research suggests it should boost workforce participation and economic growth. So I am interested in what is really holding this policy back. It seems like it's a good return on investment.
So I think there is a view within within the economic orthodoxy that this is very important for incentivising women to work. That is that women are currently working so that they don't look after their children, and if they get access to childcare without having to work, suddenly they're just going to pop their kids in childcare and quit their job. Now, I think that is very unlikely, and in fact, economic theory would say that as long as you're getting a marginal benefit from that extra hour of work, you're still going to work. That's the incentive. It's not about not seeing your kids. But there is that belief, I think, amongst some economists that that's the case. So that's one of the reasons. That's why the policy's there. In terms of the change and the speed of change, I know there are concerns about the capacity of the system. We do have, big issues at the moment in terms of workforce across the childcare sector, and that need to increase the wage rate to get more workers into the sector to address those supply issues. So that is one of the concerns. I think for me, though, really is each year we don't do this, there are kids that are missing out. And that's it, right? We all know, and those of us who have children, those years are critical. And so if you don't invest now, you don't get the benefits, and you're always going to have those costs. And so for me, it is just absolutely the most critically important thing that we're investing in these kids today, because if we miss this opportunity for another year, it's another year that there's another kid, and there are more kids starting school who haven't benefited, and they will pay the cost throughout their life. And we know that now. We have great studies, we've got great data sets that can track these kids through time. And you see that they never catch up, they're less likely to finish school. If they don't finish school, they're less likely to work, they'll be in lower paid jobs. But we can make that decision now to invest in these children. And I think for me, that's why, particularly in this current environment, when it's these kids in low-income families that are most affected, that we invest in these kids today.
John Keogh.
Thanks very much, ladies. One thing I'm curious about is that now we're seeing more females in leadership position in economics and in the economics fraternity at senior positions. Do you think that influences the policy debate, the emphasis on what policies are important, the policy prescriptions? I mean, traditionally, probably being guilty of this myself, we talk a lot about tax reform, industrial relations, regulation. Do you think women bring a different perspective in terms of what the priorities should be?
It's a great question. I think that I'd probably put my own focus on the discipline of economics, and I think that the discipline of economics has had some blind spots, right? It has some areas that it looks at very intensely and other areas that it hasn't historically looked at as intensely, or has put in little lanes like household economics. And I think that the difference in perspective is that a more diverse group of people tend to not have the same blind spots. We've all got blind spots, but we have different blind spots. And so I think what we're seeing is the elevation of certain areas that were always important, but weren't necessarily high on the interest list of the sorts of people who are engaged on economic policy. So for me, it might be women, or it might be people from different backgrounds, different class backgrounds, people from different cultural backgrounds. We have different blind spots. We tend to focus on different things.
And just drawing on from what Aruna said, I think it just helps against groupthink, like if you can engage in all forms of diversity and inclusion. But what I would add is that we've been collecting data sets for quite a long time, and now there's actually greater availability of more granular data. And so actually that greater granular data can actually help us target the areas or develop policy and design policy that is far more targeted as we go forward.
Look, I think I would say definitely. I think one of the things that the Women's in Economic Network has done is it's brought female economists together, and you've seen as women are speaking out and talking about these issues more women come behind, and then also it's influenced, I think, the way men economists and male economists talk about these issues. And certainly we saw in the past, the lacklustre performance of Australia over a generation when it came to female participation was really, really poor, but it was seen that we were successful. We've got the highest rate of female participation in the world. Forget the fact that, in the OECD, one of the highest rates of part-time work, that we were locking women out of full-time careers with our policies. But that's been called out now, and I think we are looking at the ways in which that's tackled and which it's addressed. So certainly, yes, I think that not only, as I said, has the aesthetic changed in terms of we've got more female faces on our TV talking about economics, which is important, that young girls in particular, some of whom are here today, see female leaders and female economists up there so that they can strive for that. But the way we talk about economics, I think, has fundamentally shifted, which is a good thing for women, but it's fundamental if we're going to drive future economic growth and sustainable economic growth. So it's been a really good thing for the economy as well. I mean, and you only have to look at labour force participation of women over the last 2 to 3 years. It's been fundamental, and it will be fundamental to economic growth. So we need to address these barriers that have stopped women fully participating in work. And I hope, well, I'm going to claim it. I'm going to claim the impact that the Women in Economics Network has had a really big role, and this event has had a huge role in doing that year after year over the last 8 years.
Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian, thanks for your address. I just had a couple of quick ones. The first was about, we've spoken a lot about the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee. Obviously, this is the second time it is reporting, but the Women's Economic Equality Task Force was like a one-off, sort of a 12-month committee, it made recommendations to government and so on, and now it's gone. Should that have been the case? Should we actually have, similar to the EIAC, this to be an ongoing body to keeping this stuff on the agenda? And secondly, if I could, the Treasurer described the response to last week's inflation figure as an overreaction. Do you agree with that? And should Chalmers do more in the budget to make the RBA's job a bit easier?
Well, I'll start. Look, I think there would be merit in having an ongoing body in terms of just, thinking about, well, what are the next steps? Because we really are talking here fundamentally about ensuring that the economy is structured in a way and government policies are actually facilitating women's economic participation, and that's going to be a journey. It's not like it happens and you have one budget announcement and it's done. So it is a building. So look, I'd certainly support that, and I think it was actually a recommendation of the task force itself that there be a continuing body. In terms of inflation, I think we do need to be careful, because I think as economists we go, oh, it's 0.2 out, it's a disaster, and then next month it's corrected, right? So we do need to be a little bit careful about, claiming that this is disastrous, especially, on these month-on, month-off figures and the volatility in those. But it is also true that we should expect that inflation may well take a bit longer to come down, and it's going to be stickier, and it's going to be a much harder path. Inflation is just one of those things. It is a terribly wicked problem in economics, and getting that price stability back is really important. It erodes living standards, as we've talked about today. And so that trajectory is important. And in terms of whether, fiscally we should be doing more, I think having a balanced approach is really important. It does need to be carefully moderated, though. As we said, you don't want to push us into recession to defeat inflation either. There's a narrow path there, and I think it's really about having those cool heads, about being really targeted about what you're spending on and really disciplined, and not adding unduly to inflation in this environment.
And if I can just pick up on Angela's thread, I think where the overreaction might be is from financial markets. So before that inflation report, financial markets were fully priced for a rate cut before the end of the year. Come out that inflation report and you actually see them move to a rate hike. In fact, they moved to about 44% chance of a rate hike. It's hard to see that that's not an overreaction. I would say the threshold for a rate hike is quite high, given that we are seeing softening in economic activity, we are seeing consumer spending in per capita terms go backwards, we are seeing forward-looking indicators of employment softening, which suggests that unemployment will pick up. So that does suggest a bit of an overreaction, but at the same time, when you look at the Consumer Price Index report, it does suggest some risks around stickiness in inflation. I always talk about my youngest daughter at home. She likes to squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube. She hears me coming, she's in trouble because she also decorates the basin. So she tries to put the toothpaste back into the tube. And that's quite hard to do, particularly... Don't try it at home. But it is quite hard to do with services inflation. And so I think we're seeing some of those risks around services inflation. And I think for policymakers, they're also looking across to the United States. And in the US, they've had 3 inflation reports in a row that have been higher than expected. They've got strong payrolls more recently. And that's just suggesting too that in the United States there's some persistent price pressures. In fact, in the United States at the start of this year, markets were pricing in 6 rate cuts, and they're now only pricing in 1 and a bit. So there's just been a very dramatic shift. And so I think, some of the risks, including the ones that I spoke about around the mega trends, it just suggests it might take a little bit more time for inflation to come back to the target band. And Jim Chalmers is going to have to keep that in mind when he's framing the budget.
Thank you.
Rachel Clune.
So, given what Sarah just said before about the Economics Inclusion Advisory Committee, this is the second report, similar kind of recommendations to last time. Curious as to how you feel about the fact the government hasn't fully adopted them, and given, Besa, what you just said about the kind of really tricky economic circumstances we're in right now, is this the budget to adopt those fully given those circumstances?
That's a good question. I think the role of the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee over time, and it's evolving, right? It's a new thing, and we're going to do more work over the next 12 months around sort of defining poverty and measuring poverty in particular, so that we can provide that update to the government each year and how it's doing. It is that building thing though, right? So I think our job isn't to dictate, you must do this, and if they don't do everything that we stipulate, it's somehow a failure. But it is around holding them account in terms of, look, these are the priority areas that we've identified this year. These are some of the policy areas you need to be thinking about and acting in. And over time that we do build, I guess, that bridge to a more inclusive economy. So I'm not somebody who's in that it has to happen overnight, otherwise it's a failure. It is a building block type situation, and we did see them pick up a number of the reforms from last year, and I certainly hope, I haven't, I've got no preemption about what's going to be in the budget, that we see some more in the budget in 2 weeks' time.
Jack Quayle.
Thanks very much for your address. My question goes to housing. I mean, you've discussed that quite in depth in all your addresses, but the Coalition Super for Housing Policy, do you see any merits in the proposal to at least withdraw a proportion of superannuation to pull together a house deposit?
For the people who most need assistance to get into the housing market, their super balances aren't really going to help them very much. So there's just a bit of reality around who has significant wealth in super that they can draw upon, or are they the people who really, are struggling to get themselves out of rental and into stable housing. So some reservations there. I mean, there's been it does have an impact in terms of demand in the market. It does have an impact on prices. There's been some estimates around that are maybe on the high side. But I think coming back to the fundamental problem we're dealing with, Besa made the point. The key thing we need here is supply, not demand. And the key thing we need to grapple with in the short term is that we can see the construction pipeline ahead of us, and we're not going to get that supply anytime soon. So how do we cushion the blow for the people who can least handle the coming period? And those are people facing the rental market, and those are likely people on rent assistance who are facing increases in rent, no respite coming anytime soon. I doubt, if you did the numbers, that they would be significantly assisted by the super policy.
Sorry, did you want to say something, Besa?
I was just going to reiterate, I think it's a terrible idea. It would only leave people who did it probably worse off. It is a band-aid solution. It seems like it's solving a problem, and I can see the appeal of it. And it's my super and I should be able to use it, but we know it will just increase prices by even more than they withdraw. So in the end, they'll just be borrowing more and they'll be poorer overall because they won't have their super and they will have paid more for the house, and have more debt as a result. We need more than band-aid solutions. Like, we need structural reform to our housing market. It's an incredibly important part of our economy in terms of size and broader economic impact and its impact on living standards more broadly, and it is broken in this country. And a lot of us who own houses in this room benefit from that, but overall our economy is a lot poorer as a result. So we need real structural reform that increases supply, that removes the distorting taxation of housing, and that really starts to address the housing crisis. It's a hard area, right? Like, that's why politicians haven't gone there. But without it, we're just going to continue to be poorer as a result.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS News. I just wanted to get your opinion on the foreign investment changes that Jim Chalmers has announced today. Are they a good idea? Do they go far enough? Are there any challenges?
I think you're going to get no one seeing his speech today. Anna, so do you want to outline what they are? Press Club.
Yeah, a foreign investment shake-up that he has announced today, which relates to national security concerns, so really targeting that investment to particular countries and potentially cutting off, I don't want to put words in the Treasurer's mouth, but cutting off some investment opportunities on critical infrastructure and also critical minerals where it might cause a problem for our national interest.
It's probably partly a response, without having seen the details. Some of it might be a response to some of what's already happening around the world. We're seeing around the world that developed economies and even developing economies are turning more inward. You've got geopolitical risks that have really risen and creating risks around supply chains. And so there's an economic impact from that, but there's also a strategic interest impact from that the government's got to consider. And so I think some of those changes may be echoing some of these bigger global forces that are occurring, and they've got to be considered in that framework.
Thank you. Peter Martin.
Peter Martin, The Conversation. Aruna, you mentioned fiscal policy being not a blunt instrument. In other words, it's brilliant. Unlike interest rates where you affect everyone and people you don't even want to, you can tailor it. What's an example? And I ask that because the one example, the big example the government did in the budget was helping renters on Commonwealth rent assistance. That was tailored, so it helped people who most needed. And to the extent that it was inflationary, it wasn't inflationary everywhere else. What's an example of the sort of clever thing the government could do with fiscal policy that couldn't possibly do with interest rates?
Well, there's probably no shortage of examples, but I think that so you've spoken about rent assistance. Looking at things like
you don't
New Start,
like that,
so like looking at things like New Start, right, that are pegged really low. If you've already got a form of social security that is inadequate, and then you have the kind of inflationary environment that we're facing, that only turbocharges the difficulty that people who are on government support face. Now, obviously, New Start is indexed to inflation, right? So it does travel with inflation, but it's at a level that is too low. So one of the things you could do is you could provide greater support to people at the bottom end of the distribution, but not necessarily be too troubled about the bracket creep that you're going to see. And I think this comes back to Angela's point about the stage 3 tax cuts, right? Like, if you step back from the immediate environment, is there a cause to return bracket creep over time? Yes, there is. Because otherwise, over time, you're going to end up taking more and more from working people, and that's going to affect your tax mix. But at this particular moment, bracket creep is serving precisely that sort of more nuanced fiscal policy role, which is that it hits people who can afford it harder. And for my part, I think kind of echoing what Angela said, letting some of that happen without necessarily trying to give it back at this stage in time would be the thing that fiscal policy can do, particularly given we're likely to see an inflationary environment for some time. And I think some of the instinct with monetary policy is you can act really quickly, right? Like, you can raise interest rates, you've got a meeting every month and you can go. But the problem we're facing has gone on for a couple of years now, and so that's the sort of time horizon where fiscal policy can be really effective.
But you want them to be going in the same direction, ideally, in this environment. And that's why it's important for measures to be well designed and to be highly targeted.
Melissa Code.
Hi, Melissa Code from The Mandarin. You've each respectively talked about the need for big policy reform, more public appetite for engaging with the economic debate and conversation in Australia, and long-termism. My sense is that the extent to which the everyday layperson follows these conversations sort of stops at how does this impact me? And I think of amazing articles written by SBS saying this is how you will benefit from the stage 3 tax cuts. See where you fit in this table. To what extent do you think we need to shift the way policymakers and representatives in the media engage the public in these bigger questions about democracy being an exercise in governing ourselves, as you put it?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that is really tempting whenever there's a change is to seek out the oppositional perspectives, right? Who's the winner, who's the loser, let's pit them against each other. And that makes a great story because, it's easy and it's engaging. I think that's what gets us into trouble, though, because there's always going to be a loser. And you end up in this world where in policy reform there can be no losers. And if you're in a position where you can spend lots of money, potentially you can pay the losers off. So you can make sure that you've constructed your policy reform so that anyone who's going to be worse off doesn't really feel worse off. But the fiscal envelope we're facing, the structural problems we're facing, makes it much harder for government to construct policy reforms so that, nobody is distressed, or no one's upset. So I think that it comes back to the media of is that the best way to tell the story? Do we need to be setting these things up as binaries of winners and losers? Can we think about the nature of the problem we're trying to solve, and then where is the evidence? Where are the long-term costs and benefits? Is there a decision that we can collectively reach that we think, actually, on this one, there is a basis for consensus. There are some things where we won't find that consensus, but I think there are a few things where, particularly as the electoral dynamics change generationally, we can start to see a bit of a consensus around how much we want to tax working people versus wealth, how much we want to spend currently on our public service system, if that's just going to mean that we're pushing debt onto the next generation and we're not going to be able to afford those sorts of services for them.
And I think the younger people are more concerned about the future, and we need, if you just look at the net transition to zero and climate change, I think younger Australians are really interested in that. So I guess what I was trying to say with the long-termism lens is we can also look at other challenges that we have and trying to address them in a way that leaves other generations better off. I think the problem with TikTok and Instagram is they're all very short-term grabs, and so 6 seconds I think is the rule that you've got to engage the reader. So you've got to try and grab the reader or the listener in 6 seconds about these big issues. And so I think it does come back to what Aruna was talking about, which is trying to shift the behaviours a bit, so we are thinking a bit more longer term.
Yeah, and I think, look, the responsibility, I guess, of the media in this environment, it's a challenging environment. We've been talking about, social media, and it has created, what sometimes feels quite dangerous in terms of the way information is moderated, who sees what and how. That common narrative that we've relied on the media for has really broken down, but it actually makes the media even more important as a source of facts and a source of common understanding of issues. So I think for me, the media's role in this is really presenting the facts, of not getting too caught up in this partisan debate, that we really just try and be as impartial as possible in the approach. And I think back to when I was a young child reading The Australian, and it was a very factual paper, for example, and I think publications like that our media really doesn't try and chase the clickbait, but keeps its role in our democracy is going to be really important.
Nick Stewart.
In the last few years, the NDIS has more than doubled from 17 billion to more than 40 billion. A former productivity commissioner has in fact suggested that it would have been better not going ahead with it. There are incredible demands on defence to make sure that our defence as proportion of GDP spending rises. There are huge demands on the budget. What
I don't see as an ordinary Australian is any sort of similar revenue rises. Won't this budget be a complete failure unless it actually raises more revenue, tells us how we're going to get out of that long-term structural deficit?
Well, that's the longer term challenge that really the federal government faces. You've got expenses growing from areas of spending on NDIS, aged care, health, defence, and you've got geopolitical risks rising, so arguably even more. So you've got that trend of expenses rising. At the same time, you've got revenues that are, as a share of GDP, quite high, and so there is more pressure for revenues to keep up with those growing expenses, and that is a challenge. In the near term, the budget surplus will probably move from 22 billion to possibly 18 billion, but that's thanks to a bunch of factors that arguably might be temporary in nature. So you've got low unemployment, so they haven't had to pay out as much in terms of unemployment benefits or other social welfare payments. You've got higher commodity prices than expected. Iron ore's a long way where the federal papers estimated it to be last time. And you've also got an economy that has done a bit better than expected. So the combination of those factors may not actually hold. So the challenge that they have over the longer term is that structural challenge, and one in which they do need to see revenues keep up with those growing expenses. And again, those megatrends that I was talking about, they'll also overlay on top of that.
You have to do all of the things, right? You have to tackle those sources of serious expenditure growth as well as think about the revenue picture. I mean, to be fair to governments, you do need a lead in on some of those big revenue.
We're journos. We don't need to be fair to government.
So I'm not expecting big revenue reform in this budget, but nor would that necessarily be appropriate if we haven't had the debates that we need to. But leading into this next election, yes, absolutely. We need to be putting these things on the table, because we can't have another government come in with no mandate to do anything because they didn't raise it at the election. But on the spending growth, you mentioned, defence. Yes, the geopolitical environment is getting more complex. Yes, that may warrant more spending, but how we do that spending, like how we do our procurement, do we have any control over cost overruns? There are some practical questions about, how we put into effect decisions in that space. With NDIS, I mean, the growth has outstripped all predictions, and that's down to both participant numbers and average scheme cost. It's a really difficult area of debate, but I don't think we can realistically shy away from putting that scheme on a sustainable footing, and that means both looking at eligibility and what supports are provided outside of the scheme as well as inside the scheme, and then also making sure that the agency that's responsible for the scheme has a set of rules by which it can determine what services are in and out, and then manage the financial sustainability with a kind of a level playing field for participants rather than differential decision making. So I'm actually optimistic that there are things that can be done on some of those areas of big spending growth. But realistically, yes, we have to look at spending, we have to look at revenue, and we want to grow the economy at the same time.
We're almost out of time, but I'm just going to ask a double-barrel question, which is two completely separate questions, actually. First of all, just taking up Nick's point about rising revenue and what you've said, as part of that agenda got to be, for the next election, looking again at the GST, about the amount we collect, and we're having a debate about how it's distributed next week with the West Australians. Should we be also debating that? And secondly, there's a lot of talk today about housing, and you're all essentially saying it's a supply problem that's not going to fix with the best intentions in the world short term. Is there anything that the government can actually do in the budget that will realistically change the rental prospects of low-income people?
How about I take GST?
Yeah, I can't.
So, look, with GST, yes, and Grattan Institute's previously called for an increase in the rate, probably as a second best solution. So let me talk about the first best solution. When the GST was designed, it was meant to grow at pace with the economy and give the states the thing that we shouldn't lose track of, which is actually an untied source of revenue that enables them to do their jobs in our system of government. It doesn't require them to go back to the Commonwealth and negotiate terms every 5 years. So the GST plays a really important role, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of our federation. It was meant to keep pace with the growth in the economy, but there's some pretty big carve-outs, and for health and for education. And the consequence of that is that it's not going to keep pace with the economy. So the first best solution actually is to broaden the base of the GST and to start capturing some of those areas that as we get older, as we get richer, we spend more money on, which are currently GST exempt. That is, I think, it's a difficult conversation, but I think it's one that we can have publicly. Then there's the question of the rate. An interesting question is whether if you could get the broadening of the base, you wouldn't necessarily need to think about raising the rate. But the other option is that you do raise the rate. There's the possibility there that you could share that upside between the federal government and the state governments. But I personally spent a decent chunk of time working in a state government, and the pressures on state governments are real. Like, they're the ones who provide our hospitals, our schools, our roads. And so I think for me, GST reform has to remain in the frame. And yes, the WA GST deal is a cracker of a bad policy idea that should be unwound.
I think as Australians, we have an over-reliance on income tax. I think there's no doubt that it would be good to see a system that moved towards more of a consumption tax, which is Aruna's spoken to. I think on housing, I'm actually going to say that any measure that's announced, if we're not looking at it holistically and we're not looking at it in terms of planning and tenancy laws and the interaction of taxes, and we're not engaging in all forms of government across all stakeholders, including the private sector, then we're really just tinkering and we're just kicking the problem down the road, and we've done that for 4 decades. So I think it really probably does require that long-term, multi-pronged, bold reform that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, look, I'd agree. I can't comment on GST, but I can comment in terms of housing. It's not one thing. I think often we get this, it's a supply, it's a demand, it's this, it's planning, it's tax. It's everything. Like, this is broken. It's not like one thing. It needs a holistic reform across a suite of policies. And one area, I mean, if you wanted a quick win, in my view, and this is completely against what I think should happen from a moral perspective, but I think the way in which the age pension asset test works is locking up a lot of supply. Like, we talk about supply as just building, but supply is there if it was better allocated. So there's an allocative efficiency point of view. You could look, and I don't necessarily say, I would say, you know, this is the one I'd go out on the streets and necessarily argue for, but you could look at a holiday or removing that asset test so that people could just sell their homes in the next, say, 2 years, and that they qualify for the pension for life. So you'd take away that disincentive that's in the system, because we just have a system at the moment that incentivises, particularly, number one, that people don't sell because of stamp duty reform, which is the other area the Commonwealth could look at. But then for older Australians, and you know, there's 20% at the moment of people aged over 65 are in houses with 3 or more excess bedrooms, right? Like, there are people who are just swimming in houses who need to downsize, but they're incentivised to stay in their house because if they sell it, they pay stamp duty and they lose the pension. So you could provide a sort of lifelong holiday for those people. It's not great from an equity point of view, it's not great public policy, but it would, I think, help speed up some of that allocative efficiency, get more houses onto the market much faster. But we do need big reform in this space, and it's hard. I mean, when you look at stamp duty and land tax reform, it's difficult, right? And states that have tried to do it, they've done it here in the ACT, big tick, but you know, in other places it's politically very fraught. So, but we do need to be looking at it, and we do need, I think, the political fortitude to address it. Otherwise, we're going to be talking, you know, we think about what the prospects looks like for our kids. Imagine our grandkids, what this market's going to look like if we don't fix these problems. They're not going to get easier as time goes on.
Well, you've all given us great food for thought, and as a part of a reward, you've got memberships to the National Press Club to come back and see us. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your contribution.